Hello, I'm Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator at Kansas City Public Schools. Welcome to Homeroom. Today we're going to talk more about the labor's response to big business in the Gilded Age. So what you need today is a pencil and paper and basically be ready to learn. Today's objective, we're going to explain the socio-economic change and continuities associated with the growth of industrial capitalism from 1865 to 1898. Remember, this is a huge era of change. This is a huge era basically where you start seeing the growth of the middle class. You start seeing people with leisure time. But to get there, we have to start talking about changes that were going on with the American workplace. So, you remember the Civil War, basically there was a labor scarce. You saw a lot of people die in the Civil War, especially in the South. You start seeing these industrial cities such as Atlanta, Birmingham, Alabama start popping up, but you had a scarcity in labor. Also, you had this huge immigration boom. See, these immigrants saw America as basically as a land of luxury and excess, right? So when they started coming over, labor saw them as cheap. They saw them as cheap, right? Because these immigrants needed jobs to survive in this new world. So industrials saw these people as cheap labor. Immigrants wanted to Americanize. Basically, they wanted to find these unique identities. So a lot of times, these immigrants would basically settle in these enclave cities. You heard of Little Italy, like in New York. That's where they started settling with people that look like themselves and talk like themselves, right? Like Irish. A lot of them come to the Midwest, places like Kansas City, because a lot of people like them started settling in this area. They basically felt comfortable basically living with people around them. Cities clearly reflect basically the divided socio-economic conditions among class, races, ethnicities, and cultures, but represented new economic opportunities for all, right? So, what was labor's response to all this going on? So you start seeing labor's response. You start seeing these unions pop up. 1866, you saw the National Labor Union. It exceeded over 600,000 members, guys. That was a lot of people in this time frame become members of this union. So you start seeing it grow. You start seeing it manifest. But this first union only lasted about 6 years. It basically died off about 1872. And they ignored black women and Asians and workers basically in their needs. So now you start seeing again, you start seeing these unions starting going to these Protestant white males or these new immigrants basically swelling their numbers up, but they were forgetting about African Americans, they were forgetting about women, and they're forgetting about Asians, right? People who've been here and doing the jobs along the side of these white males, right? So, by 1869, you start seeing the Knights of Labor. It started as a secret organization, but by 1881, it became this public organization. You start seeing these numbers just swell. Boom, right? You know, I always go that boom because that's a big point. You start seeing these numbers just grow, right? But they barred people who drink liquor, gamblers, lawyers, bankers from membership. And they wanted social and economic basically reforms going on through society. Some of the social reforms, basically you start seeing the temperance movement, right? Economics, you want to see an 8-hour workday, right? That all makes a difference. That was all part of these reforms that we're going to start talking about in the populist movement. The Knights of Labor, basically this was led by Terence Powderly. He had goals, right? We always talk about goals. He wanted an 8-hour workday. He wanted workers own factories. Basically, he was going back to this idea of Marxism, right? You know, the working class basically own the factories of labor, right? So that was that idea coming from. He wanted to abolish basically workers in child prisons. No longer did basically become a debt to this factory, right? That factory owes you a debt basically in your pay. And he wanted to just reform American society. And he wanted equal pay for men and women during this time frame. If they do the job, they deserve equal pay. This is basically a revolutionary idea going forward we're still fighting about. And he wanted to abolish the federal bank system. He felt like the federal bank system was basically a crutch on the working class. So membership started growing, right? Remember, industrialists basically were led by these robber barons. 1885, again, these robber barons were emboldened. They knew that the federal government had their back. We talked about this last week when we talked about some of those quotes as far as President Hayes, sending National Guard, sending federal troops, they'll quash these strikes. So Elliot Gold, he knew that basically the federal government had his back if the strike would last, right? And people saw that. People saw these unions basically. He didn't realize this was a tactical error. Basically, this helped grow union membership during this time frame. Union membership started growing. It wasn't about 20 years in the past. We were going forward in society. So basically, people wanted these social reforms going on basically with the workers. So Elliot Gold made a miscalculation with that. He started seeing membership grow. So the growth of membership basically led to bigger representation. New members wanted to focus on basically on other issues too. So you have to understand with the growth in this population, these people had diverse interests, right? Some of these diverse interests didn't represent the union interests. So sometimes you can go too big too fast. This is what happened with this union. It went too big too fast. So we have to talk about the Market Riot in Chicago. This is basically a meeting. 80,000 Knights of Columbus basically gathered in Chicago. This is basically supposed to be a union gathering, basically a mass meeting, a get-together, right? Among the memberships are led by some anarchists, right? And our anarchists, basically, they don't believe in government. They don't believe, basically, the federal government should be in place. So hundreds of anarchists attended this calling. They called for the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. In American society, when you start to overthrow the U.S. government, what tends to happen? Bam, right? The U.S. government comes in and basically cracks heads and basically splits you guys up. This is what happened. Eight anarchists was rounded up, right? 5 of them were executed by the governor, John Altgeld. Basically, he pardoned the 3 survivors. But this is political suicide in his outcome. He tried to run for government for the next term. He actually was defeated roundly. The Haymarket Square bomb basically ruined the Knights of Columbus. Again, if we think about last week, we talked about the middle class, right? We talked about how the middle class didn't believe basically in these unions, didn't believe in workers' rights. This was one of those incidents basically that led them to believe that because they thought they were anarchists. They thought they were basically, these communists wanted to basically, well, let me take that term back. It wasn't communists, socialists, basically who didn't believe in government and who didn't believe in social order, right? So, we're still dealing with some of those issues today. So, let's do a knowledge check. What are some ways that industrialists basically try to stop workers from unionizing during this time frame? All right, they hire immigrant workers, right? So if I hire an immigrant worker, they're cheap, right? I hired union busters to break up that strike. And we use federal government protections, right? Because we knew the federal government would come in and save our day if we basically just wait them out. So, now fast forward. 1886, American Federation of Labor was founded, right? By Samuel Gompers. He'll become a presidential candidate here in the future. We'll talk about him later. Basically, he demanded fair share for workers, better wages, better hours, and better working conditions. The whole thing that unions basically strive for. He basically put it in context, right? He wanted a bigger membership for all workers. But most of the people who joined basically the American Federation of Labor tended to be skilled labor, which only made 3% of the workers during this time frame. But he had big ideas. And some of those big ideas going forward basically helped reform American society. So Samuel Gompers was basically a forward thinker and understanding that society needed to change and what he thought about workers. He started seeing wins for labor during this time frame. So basically, those early unions, they basically built the foundation for what Gompers basically set forward. So the costs. From 1891 to 1899, strikes cost businesses $45 million during this time frame. Imagine that in today's society. That'd be close to probably about $4 billion during this time frame now. All right? Business owners lost more money fighting strikers than meeting their demands. So now you start seeing this shift where owners are saying, you know what? Why am I fighting this? Basically, if I can get these workers on my side, I can get loyal customers too, right? So you start seeing basically business start shifting their minds, saying, you know what? Maybe we do need these social changes. Maybe less hours are better. Maybe we don't need to hire child workers. Maybe, you know what? Maybe some of these moms can stay home, basically take care of these kids. Maybe we need to reform American society. So you start seeing industrialists start thinking, maybe American society needed to change. Maybe I need to change my business practices. So this change in American society was huge during this time frame. And it helped lead to the age of labor. As we move forward, we're going to start talking about big gains and basic labor, especially with like the populist movement going forward in the next 20 years. So you start seeing America start to change. You start seeing workers with basically more free time. You start seeing this more of a leisure class going forward, and we'll talk about in the next lecture. All right, so let's do the we do. Let's talk about what's going forward in American society. How did immigrants play a part in the growth of the labor movements? All right, how did immigrants play a part? Basically, industrialists try to use them as a tool, right? So industrialists try to use them as cheap labor going forward in American society. But unions saw them as basically to strengthen their ranks. So unions, basically, especially the same conference, American Federation of Labor, basically wanted to swell their ranks with these immigrant workers. In what ways were unions different during this time frame? Okay, so Goppers basically brought that vision of what these other unions wanted to do, right? So he talked about growing these ranks, correct? With, immigrants, with women, with blacks, with the Irish. While these other unions were like, you know what, we want Protestant white males part of our unions. So you start seeing this different contrasts with these unions during this time frame. So you start seeing the shifts though, right? American society was shifting during this time frame too. So by 1900, we started seeing more people joining unions. Let it be black, let it be immigrants, let it be women. You start seeing the growth in this union basic ranks because they saw these numbers basically improving the working conditions of the working class. No longer did we have to worry about kids getting their fingers cut off. No longer do we have kids working 16-hour work days. We can send the moms home right to work. So you start seeing that shift too, basically who was working during this time frame too. We're going to talk about all this in the next few lectures. So I want you guys to remember to put that in the back of your mind. So, the you do. We discussed about the growth of the labor movement and industrial response to labor. Now, as America is growing, you should be able to write a paragraph about the socio-economic factors that push the growth and how does this affect American society. So now, going forward, I want you to start forward thinking. Think about what you know about today's society. We already talked about limited resources, right? We talked about limited resources in American society. We talked about the envious classes of the middle class looking at the upper class and want to be part of them. So going forward, I want you to start thinking about some of these ideas. Basically, now I'm joining a union. I'm working less hours. Do I want to be part of this upper class now? And what did that do for my family? Basically, what goals did it set for my family? Think about some of those ideas that we went forward. I'm Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator, Secondary... I messed that up. God. I'm close, though.
Do the last part. So you had it 13 minutes right there, so perfect. Yeah. We're doing the last part again. Yeah. 3, 2.
All right, so now we're on the you do. I want you to discuss about the growth of labor and the industrial response to labor. Now that the American cities are growing, I want you to be able to discuss and write a paragraph about the socio-economic factors of this growth and how did this affect American society. You should be able to think about some of these ideas. Think about some of basically your own family. Think about it. You want to think about your own family about 20 years down the road. Do you want to still live in the same conditions or do you want to improve your working conditions, right? You want to improve basically your education conditions. I want you to think about some of that stuff. Think about some of these workers going forward. The 1920s was a booming era. That's 20 years forward during this time frame. Think about some of those ideas. Write that paragraph over what was going on in American society. I want you to think about this social change that was happening in American society. I'm Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator, Kansas City Public Schools. Well, thank you for coming to Homeroom. See you guys later.